Hello everyone, selamat datang and a very good day. Welcome back to the virtual colloquium organized by the Institute of Teacher Education, International Languages Campus, Kuala Lumpur. The theme for this year's webinar is Humanizing Teaching and Learning, the Dynamics of Language Education in the Waves of Global Change. I'm Munira, your moderator for today's session. Welcome to the 17th webinar of our virtual colloquium, and I hope you will stay tuned till the end of the session. Today, we have a very special speaker. He is the Honorable Rector for International Islamic University, Malaysia. But before we listen to his talk, let me lay out a few housekeeping matters. First, everyone who attends to this webinar series will be given an e-certificate after each session. Therefore, do not forget to register yourself now. Make sure to type accurate email address. The registration link is pinned at the bottom of this YouTube channel. Second, we would love to hear from you during today's presentation. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the chat box. The speaker will be answering the questions at the end of the session. If we don't answer your question during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. And finally, we'd like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. Now, allow me to introduce our speaker for today. Professor Emeritus Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak is currently the Rector of the International Islamic University, Malaysia. He is the Governor of the Regional Center for Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development based in University Science Malaysia, starting from 2005. Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli was awarded the prestigious 2017 Gilbert Medal by Universitas 21 in recognition for his long-term commitment to a sustainable approach in international higher education. He is also an advisory board member, Institute of Sustainable Development and Learning at Pana University of Lüneburg, Germany from June 2019. More recently, in October 2020, he was appointed as a member of Qatar Foundation Higher Education Strategy Advisory Panel. In February 2021, he was invited to serve as an expert for the Futures of Higher Education project at UNESCO's Institute for Higher Education. Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli is a recipient of a number of honorary doctorates from various international universities and received many awards for his dedication in his work. Humanizing language education in the post-pandemic context. This is the topic for today's webinar. Equity and inclusion are among the most concerning issues brought about by the coronavirus pandemic. In the teaching of language, it is no different, where the challenge is to build trust and solidarity among a diverse population through effective communication and deeper understanding. This is made even more pertinent with the rapid global spread of the virus, regardless of the culture and civilizational barriers. It therefore calls for the various innovative humanizing approaches in ensuring that humanity thrives in riding the global waves of change. So Tan Sri, we are very excited to hear more about this topic. So without further delay, please welcome Tan Sri Dato Dzulkifli Abdul Razak. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Munira, for this. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. Greeting of peace to everybody everywhere. I'm indeed very honored and very delighted to be here with you to discuss a very special topic, which is difficult, but I think it is necessary for us to come into terms with what we are doing, not only in the context of language education, but I guess the context of overall education given the pandemic 19 COVID-19, and also the threat to human lives in particular, regardless of where you are and who you are. So I think this is a very timely topic when we talk about language in the context, as Dr. Munira put it, humanity. Language is a very important tool to bind human species together, to get humanity on the go. We are not able to operate this without language, and also with only limited understanding of what languages are. And therefore, I think this is a time for us to sit down and reflect how else we can do better. And humanizing language is one of those things that I think we need to be concerned with, because for a long time when we talk about education, it is not about humanizing anything. It is more about economy, it's more about livelihood, it's not about life and the people around it. So time, I think, has come for us to refocus, as what the pandemic has forced us to do in various circumstances and various occasions for us to do this. So let me share you my slides, if I could, and I hope it works. Normally, okay, there you are. We are going to discuss in the waves of global change. And that global change for me is about the post pandemic context. Within Asia, in particular, I think we understand Asian situation better, and the 21st century and beyond. Yeah. A little bit of words of the International Islamic University. This is a university which is set up in 1983, mainly to cater for education for people who are deprived of education during various times, particularly in areas of challenges of this nature. We provide education for those people who are deprived of education, uh, specifically for Muslim community who at one point or another are not very welcome to some parts of the world as far as education is concerned, and this university provides it. The university has been, the last 2 years, been recognized by the United Nations University for regional centers of expertise on sustainable development. There is a focus of the university now, how to combine education with sustainable development as part and parcel of the long-term education, that we human beings can also live within an environment that is important to us as far as the species survival is concerned. And of late, just about 2 months ago, we also accorded the UNESCO Chair for Future Studies on Sustainability and Well-being, and this will be another focus for us to look forward. What else can we do in the context of post-pandemic? What can education provide for the good of humanity overall? And this is perhaps one of the topics that we will be discussing today and this morning. So let me begin by bringing us into a kind of a context that when we talk about, it's not, when we talk about language education, I would want to actually take it in a broader sense, education in the context of knowledge seeking, knowledge dissemination, and also knowledge generation. Yeah? I know when you talk about language, there are other dimensions of language, and I am particularly worried when we talk about language for not so much for education, but for many of the things that we see today in terms of fake news, misinformation. All this, I think, has something to do with language also, but that's not the kind of humanizing education that we want to talk about. So very focused on the positive side of what language can do, so that human being can have a better future among themselves. Now, just let me briefly try to contextualize that when we talk about the use of language. What is it that we mean? But exactly like what Munira says, this is about us coming together and to build trust. And therefore, one of the values that I think when we talk about language, how do you share values? Yeah, the moment you communicate with the people, you share values, we create common platform, we have some basic standards of understanding of one another, and eventually we can take some collective decision. In the pandemic, I think it is very clear, until and unless we share the values of what life is all about, what is the meaning of, trustworthiness and also caring with one another, we are not able to take collective decision. And once in a while, you see certain parts of the world takes a very different position as we another part of the world because of the understanding of what the shared values are. So having these shared values, communicating it, understanding it, I think will benefit us in the long run as far as that's concerned. Now, when the shared values become enculturated, then we have other common beliefs that is more binding, that everybody now can subscribe to a belief without much arguments, because we know this is important for all of us, and that could be translated into practices. Language alone is not good enough until we can practice it, until we can act on it, so that this become sort of the contribution very directly to people who needs whatever help or whatever other uh, lacking in terms of their own lifestyle, so that we can actually put them in terms with whatever else that is needed around the world. And that helps us be even better to build relationships. At the end of the day, I think to me, language is about building relationships, and that relationship also translate into a kind of a lifestyle. So, in other words, if you talk about the COVID environment, the moment I understand what relationships is between me and my neighbor, then I will make sure that my lifestyle is the one that is conforming, so that my neighbor will not be affected. Yeah? In our local jungle, we say, lindung lili, lindung semua. What I do for myself actually has benefit to other people. And this becomes a kind of an understanding how we transact life together as a way of life, that we do not have to be suspicious over one another. And that creates a common understanding. And that understanding is the one that actually built on trust. And that is the trust that we are talking about as far as language is concerned. So that understanding, as I've mentioned, will help this trust in terms of the context of peaceful coexistence. We don't only coexist, but we coexist in a very peaceful manner, understanding with one another, creating tolerance, creating togetherness, and creating the kind of tacit understanding of where we come from and where we need to go together, and therefore bridging as much divides as possible. As although the COVID environment tend to split people on the context of their position or location, or what do you call privileges that they've got. Yeah, by having this understanding, we begin to share, and this sharing will probably close as much divide as possible. Finally, I think it will convert into what I was saying earlier, the kind of knowledge creation. There's some learning process that goes through. And that learning process is the one that actually goes back to where we started. It confirms the value that we believe in. It also then reaffirms where we should go together. And finally, constructing even better action together as a humankind on a common platform, so that everybody can benefit. And that benefit is what we understand today in the context of sustainable development. The things that we do is not only for a certain group of people, but it encompasses a wider dimension beyond just your borders, beyond your understanding, into humanity, or what we call it in the context of IUM, rahmatan lil alamin, mercy to everybody else, including human life, non-human life, including even our own, what do you call it, ecological system, that gives benefit as far as the biodiversity is concerned. It goes into a study of not just within one discipline, we begin to connect with other disciplines. And this is, I think, where language becomes more important, because language will help us to connect with more disciplines using different sort of metaphor or different understanding of where the language comes from, given the culture where it started off. And finally, we gain a very large focus of what the community should do together beyond just our borders. In the context of Malaysia, mungkin now we are talking about this Keluarga Malaysia, which is a community focus that everybody can help one another to build a very strong and a unified community as such. So generally, this is what it is. I use the word Corona, what do you call, advertisement there, because then the word Corona is not important to us. we probably ignore this term corona. But now with the coronavirus coming in, we also use this even in a better sense. In other words, given the pandemic, the corona pandemic, all this use of language becomes even more important, starting with the shared value, going back to the common focus of develop a sustainable development moving forward. Yeah. So language in this particular context has got its role, and I think its role is even more enhanced as you talk about the situation we are in together, that we need to bind to one another, we need to hold on to our beliefs together so that we can act in unison as a group of people who wants to survive the pandemic, as it were. So in short, again, as we mentioned, it is about diversity. It is not about one language, it is about many languages, I think, when you talk about diversity. And it's also not just a language that we verbalize. I'm beginning to think about the language of nature. It language that, sometimes you see the signals or the omens outside. When there are birds, what does it mean? When suddenly there is no birds, what does it mean? I remember the book by Rachel Carlson that talks about the silence of spring, I think. When she suddenly find that that particular spring is very quiet, there's no bird singing, there's no bird chirping, and finally it ends up by saying that no, the whole ecological system has been somehow rather poisoned, and the birds are not visiting those places anymore. Those are the kind of languages that we have lost, but those languages in nature tells us exactly what's happening, not just the verbalization, but sometimes just by hearing things, looking at things, and experiencing as a form of language that we need to also be sensitive to. So languages is in a very diverse form will help us to understand where we are and what else we need to do. And therefore, diversity, I think, in this context becomes a key word. Yeah. You can just say hello world and a few people will understand, but the more languages used, the more diverse it is, the better it is in terms of getting people together and understanding what the messages are for everybody to understand. So this context of diversity and the multitude of language we use in all sorts of manner will be the keystone as far as moving forward is concerned. But when we talk about languages now, and in fact, communication in general, we begin now to talk about this whole digital world. Yeah. This is something which is new. We take it on as though this is something that we have to do because of technology and so on and so forth. And these numbers that I give you is just to convince us. Yeah. It looks as this is the way the world is going. All right. In the total population, the number of people using handphones, internet, and so on are all the plus sciences, meaning that people are getting on board as far as the use of digital technology as a kind of communication, a language in itself. Some people make observation now the languages are also different. When you use here handphones, now your languages are more vibrated. Yeah, there's a lot more icons coming in. Very much sometimes also what you call virtual in nature and also graphic in nature. So understanding of languages, given those diversity of tools, will also affect some of the practices of rest of years in terms of trying to get messages across, right? When you look at in terms of e-commerce, again, you can see here running from fashion and beauty to physical media to furnitures and appliance, all of this also have got some bearing in terms of the communication, the choice of communication, and it doesn't seem to be very different from what we see today. Every part of our lives are touched by this kind of communication using e-commerce or using the digital. I'm trying to show you that nothing much has changed in terms of selection and choice, but only the way we manifest it and the way we reached it as far as electronic or the digital is concerned. The use of mobile phone by category, again, yeah, you can see all sorts of mobile appliances has been used. Some of it do not exist at one time. Now it becomes something which is more rampant, especially when you talk about social networking and appliances where people begin to communicate in a very rudimentary way, not long pieces, but 2 or 3 words that connect with one another. And that I think has got a bearing also when the fewer words you use, it's open to all sorts of interpretation. And sometimes the interpretation do not connect with what the messenger wants you to believe in, and this probably can cause another form of confusion or even the disruption, depending on the weight of these messages. Yeah. Now, particularly when you talk about COVID-19, you begin to see the kind of content that people are engaged with. Yeah? The top three looks as though people are more involved with films. Now, films would mean you are involved in terms of values, depending on which films you looked at, right? So there'll be now a lot more in immersion of people learning other people's culture, or it could be seen from another way around, how other cultures are influencing you. Particularly when you talk about the COVID-19, and some cultures are very open in terms of handling COVID-19. And therefore, we begin to exhibit the kind of diversity that we see other cultures responding to it. Yeah, videos and even tutorials. These are again telling us that people are now going into this kind of a media when they are locked down, where they have nothing else to do. And these are some of the choices that we see in April 2020 and just about last year. The share of web traffic, you can see again which are the traffic that is important. Some of us are involved in this. And the last but not least, I think how people spend time with their devices. Which are the most favorite devices, as it were? Smartphone, mobile phone, laptops, smart TV, streaming devices, and so on and so forth. And it also gives you another question: what about people who are not connected? What about people who do not have handphones? What about people who do not have laptops or connectivity to laptop? What sort of lifestyle do they have when you have COVID-19? And then what is the role of language? Or what is the role of these communicative tools that bring people together when you talk about bringing people together from the use of languages? So all this, I think, becomes useful data for us to get in touch with, that COVID-19 begin to modulate some of these issues that we see. And given the technological advances that we have, now many people believe that technology is a way out as far as COVID-19 is concerned. And I have my own reservation if you look at the data in the long run. Yeah. Daily time spent on media, time spent on internet, 6 hours, time spent on television, about 3 hours, time spent on social media, 2 hours. Yeah. And all of this has got impacts, right? You find now that when the moment you spend more time on devices, it has impact on you. And the impact could be as worse as what you call mental health. Yeah. Feeling loneliness, isolation, because you do not actually meet with real people in real time. And these are the devices that can take you away for a while, but it will not be a substitute as far as life is concerned during those times when we talk about COVID-19, lockdown, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So in a sense, when we talk about education in the waves of global change, I would want just to focus on this idea of digitalization. It is, I think, a policy in many countries. Certainly, Malaysia would want to look at this as a way forward. Now, what does digitalization do to human being is another question. Can we, human being, adapt and adopt to a life that is 100% digital? Meaning to say, where is the humanness as far as digitalization is concerned? Now, this is a very nice diagram. If you're familiar with the work of Leonardo da Vinci, this sort of is a profile, I think perhaps in a digital form, what we call the Vitruvian Man. The Vitruvian Man is an art that is done by Leonardo to find out what is a balance in terms of human being. He tried to portray a picture that how does a human being looks like in a very balanced way. And this is actually the original work. Yeah, he spaced it out in such a way that the length of the leg, the length of the limbs, the height of the head, yeah, are all sort of proportionally done. And to him, this sort of represents not only the human being but also the humanness. I want to underline the word humanness because we are real in this particular sense. Yeah, there is emotion, there is spirituality, and there is this sort of life that we are transacting, as compared to if we just look at this. We do not know what this is all about. Yeah, we do not know whether this is real, and the world, the digital world, whether it's real or otherwise. Yeah. So when we talk about humanizing, I think I want to come back to what is it that makes us human. This digital technology helps us to make human, or we become a kind of a second-class robot trying to live with technology, with all the demands and the necessity of what technology is defined as today. Yeah? What is important to be human is basically what is often forgotten, and that we are a balanced human being. In other words, our life as a student, as a human being, as a teacher, as whatever you are, there is a balance in our life. And once that balance has gone, then I think we become less human in a way. And this is, I think, the bigger question when we talk about technology, whether when we deal with technology, do we still keep the human balance that we are in terms of spirituality, emotion, or what you call intellectual and the physical being of the human being. This is not much talked about because for a long time, as I've mentioned, we have forgotten that we are also human. Well, we are more recognized as a human in the economic terms, a Homo economicus rather than the Homo sapiens. Yeah, we are required by the market because we support economy, not because we are a human being. Yeah, and therefore, when the economy collapses under this pressure of the pandemic, we find that human beings get disarray. They do not know how to handle themselves because their humanness has gone. They cannot function anymore in the context of just economics, when the economics lockdown or the shutdown of economy of many countries that leaves them almost unable to cope with their lifestyle. I think this is a bigger issue that I want to address when we are all homogenized, yeah, under the digital sort of platform, we lose our humanness, and we seems to be quote unquote very robotic, very mechanical, and also very very what do you call dehumanized, yeah, in the context that we are living our life today. I think this is where the question of language becomes important, because language brings in values, language brings in context, and language also bridge people together. Without language, this would be even worse off as we see it today. Now, uh, let us go back and see what has technology done to us, right? From the dawn of civilization, the classroom looks like this, and if you go back into the age of technology, you find that the classroom and it has not changed in terms of its orientation. What has changed perhaps is the machines and the tools and the gadgets, yeah, but the orientation, the position of the classroom almost remain the same. And what does this tell us? Basically, there's very little in the context of getting people to interact with one another. We are confined to the way we are structured many years ago. I will not be able to imagine a classroom that perhaps do not have standard furnitures. Yeah, why do classroom needs to have standard furnitures? Why can't we have a different way of sitting? We have sofa, we have chairs, we have other sort of furnitures that could fit different ways of style and different sort of accommodation of the individual in their own learning. That do not happen, and now it becomes more concretized when we talk about technology per se. Now, when you talk about the COVID environment, then people are beginning to see a different ways of looking at it, right? And people are beginning to talk about online. Online means that there's no necessity to have a classroom. You can be anywhere and everywhere. Yeah, working from home is one, but you can be anywhere for as a matter of fact, right? And suddenly we find that without an organization to make things happen, we run into a different kind of a problem of accommodation, a problem of trying to adjust, a problem of trying to fit in, a problem of trying to actually keep the connectivity ongoing, just like an ordinary classroom. And if this is not organized, then everything else, including language education and education per se, will not have a good effect as far as being human is concerned. I think these the issue that is now facing us when we talk about the new era, what I would call it, the era of homogenized digital era. We now seems to be all over the place, try to live in one standards, but the standards are not presentable because the technology are very unevenly spread all over the world. In Malaysia alone, we have experienced that. When we talk about online education, suddenly our brothers and sisters in Sabah will have to climb trees to get connectivity. And therefore, the whole idea of education, be it language or otherwise, become disrupted in a very significant way. So the balance that we talked about, yeah, given this kind of a situation, is really reduced to almost nothing. So it becomes an imbalanced world, an imbalanced personality, inequity in terms of education, and the whole question of fairness. And if you look at education at a level of society, that do not happen anymore because this whole concept of education, giving everybody equitable information and lifting them out of poverty do not happen anymore. So starting from that, we begin to understand now there is what we call this digital divide. All right. And once there's a divide, then everything else that depends on this divide will be affected, including language education. So the lady on my right here will probably have a better understanding as far as language is concerned as compared to the lady on the left. Yeah. And you'd be surprised that 50% of the world are actually not connected to an internet. Although we talk about internet as though it is something which is a panacea for the future, but the reality is that 50% of the worlds are not connected. When you talk about internet, we are talking about just 50% of people who are fortunate enough to be connected. Then what happened to the divides? Yeah? So we begin to see very stark sort of differences. The have-nots who do not have technology, rural areas, less educated people, low income, less industrial countries here, minorities, people with disability, they are consistently being left behind, right? And these are the people who need most help. And these are the people who needs more languages, in a sense, because they are the ones who have got a lot to ask for. And without languages, they will not be able to communicate well, and they will be even, left behind even more compared to the people that we are quite familiar with. People in the urban areas, they are more educated, they are more in tune with what's happening around it, very connected to industry, and the industry afford more facilities and advantages than normally the elitist group. Yeah, and they are normal human beings, quote unquote, in terms of abilities and so on and so forth. So this group will move forward. When you talk about the 4IR, these are the almost 100% beneficiary of the 4IR, when these people on the left will be left behind, lagging behind, and therefore the 4IR create even more disparities between people, and the use of language there becomes an issue as far as development is concerned. Yeah? So I like this picture. There is a picture of a very innocent child pretending that he has got a handphone. Yeah. And he look at his face, he's quite satisfied with the handphones that he's got. Compared to our friend here, who have got three handphones, but looks very, very miserable. Now, the message that arrives here is basically, is this technology helping us in terms of communication, or are we overdoing it? Yeah? The whole notion of languages and the use of technology, are you creating more stress, or are we getting a better sort of impact as far as the use of these handphones are concerned? So these are the other areas that we need to talk about, and we'll go into this issue a little bit more later. So the word digital natives is used almost blanketly, that as though the world now are exposed to digital technology, and therefore technology could be used to communicate with one another and enhance language education and knowledge for that matter. But the reality is that digital divides create a world of very unequal distribution and delay social progress. As I've mentioned, half of the world learners do not have a household computer. Imagine, 50%, we are talking about 3.5 billion now, if you talk about 7 billion population. And only about 45% cannot connect internet at home. So when people say, online is a solution, I tend to disagree. Because this country that lack digital advancements are considered then underdeveloped and are affected by this. And they continue to be underdeveloped because there's not enough facilities given or spared onto them, given the disparity that we talked about. They cannot communicate with one another, with other countries as efficiently, and only keep to themselves from advancing. And again, this is where I think communication and the use of language becomes directly affected. Research blames economic, political, and socio-cultural matters for the size of this gap. I think this is true. And digital equity involves not only issues of access to technology, but also the issues of unequal use, where digital practices are valued unequally in different parts of the world. In other words, the cultural dimension, and the social dimension are also affected, not just the technology per se. In the real harsh realities is about this. One of the great ironies of information age, including digital, is that while the late 12th, 20th century will undoubtedly have recorded more data than any other period in history, it will also almost certainly have lost more information than any previous data. And that is, again, something to do with language. Yeah? If you look at in the internet today, I think perhaps more than 70% of the information in the internet are in one language. And therefore, people who are not familiar with that language will find that internet is totally irrelevant to them. And particularly in less dominant countries. Yeah? In Malaysia, for example, if you were to source out information in the Malay language, I think you probably get very dismal sort of response. And I'm sure this also happened in other less dominant language, apart from English, apart from the westernized language as well. Yeah. So how information age, how the digital age threaten to destroy our culture, including the use of language, is an issue for us to think about. In other words, until and unless we have an equitable, well-expanded information or language base, then you will not be able to overcome this threat of the loss of cultural heritage. Culture is another form of language. Yeah, from the culture, our language grew, and it takes its own sort of identity within that culture that sometimes cannot be translated in any other culture. We are saying this for the word sejahtera, for example, which is equivalent to Ubuntu in Africa, which is equivalent to Ikigai in Japan. It has the same traditional human heritage as far as the value of that language is concerned. But when you try to translate sejahtera into English, you will lose the meaning altogether. Yeah, and that's why you see Japanese hardly want to translate their word into English. When they talk about kaizen, it is kaizen for them. It is not what you call. It's not improvement, quality improvement of things of that nature. Yeah, so we need to also understand that preserving the culture is preserving the language at the same time. And without that, I think language again will be lost out, and therefore education becomes meaningless. Again, it is stressed out when we talk about the coronavirus. Yeah, when the whole world is affected by coronavirus, the cry for help comes in many languages, not just one language. And this means to say that our survival depends on this multicultural dimension, the kind of language that you use. And therefore, the education of language need to be diverse at the same time, depending on the cultural context and values and the use of it in this situation. And that is this. If you just want to teach one language, then I think this whole context of the pandemic will be worse off, because we probably were not able to communicate with the people who are trying to extend help to us worldwide the way it is. So the pandemic language challenges to me, if I were to summarize it, is in the wake of the global crisis that has magnified the inequality of digital world, and hence we need to reimagine language learning so that it can contribute to a more equitable futures. So if we talk about humanizing languages, it is about how do we create an equitable future using language as a means to close up the gap as much as possible. Right? It doesn't have to be technology per se. It could be the cultural dimension that we talked about, because the cultures has been there. Just because the culture is not dominant, just because the culture is not recognized by some bodies or by some parts of the world, that doesn't mean that the culture is dead or the culture cannot sort of help us to build up this more equitable future as it is. Yeah. But more importantly, I think it's also a challenge to the ideology embedded and the use of it in the technology itself. I think it is very clear now when we talk about artificial intelligence, the use of algorithm. I think there are many studies that have demonstrated majority of the algorithm are what they call the white algorithm, meaning written by Westerners. And within that algorithm, their ideologies, their values, their norms are all written in, because that's part and parcel of how they value things and how they actually make things work. It is not their fault, because culturally, this is how they understand what life is all about. Once the algorithm is ready, and then we in this part of the world will import it as though that is the algorithm that's also useful for us. Indirectly, we are beginning to adopt, whether we realize it or not, the values that is embedded in that algorithm. In other words, we begin to think like a white man as well, because this is the only way that we can then communicate through this algorithm. So when we talk about this equitable future, then there must be different kind of algorithm representing different kind of a culture, in a way that the algorithm become quote unquote universal or neutral in that particular sense. Yeah. So we don't need to have black algorithm, white algorithm, Islamic algorithm, or other forms of algorithm, depending on who creates those algorithms. And that's what is meant here, to challenge the ideology embedded in the design and the use of technology. Yeah. Many developing countries thought that algorithm is neutral. It is not. And I think this is where we begin to be a little bit cautious. At least I became a little bit more cautious. It could be another form of colonialism. At one time, they were here, they teach us what languages are, how to teach it, and basically using their values and their own pedagogy. Now they don't have to be here. The algorithm needs to come, but the impact is still the same. In fact, it is worse because it is more pervasive than anything else. Yeah. So and worse still, I think sometimes this algorithm excludes people when you don't understand the language, as I've mentioned. It marginalizes, it excludes people, or sometimes it influences people in a very unintended way, or the invisible way, the way it is put in this particular article. Right. So these are issues that I think when we talk about humanizing education, how much do we depend on technology? How much do you depend on ideologies that is embedded in this technology? How can you humanize them? How can you make them a living sort of methodology that connects to other people's culture, other people's belief, and other people's value at the same time, rather just reorienting it to one, the way we talked about in the context of language per se. All right. Now, if we go back to our own tradition in Malaysia, and there's this book that I encounter that talks about in Malacca at one time during the 1400, almost 400 years ago, there are 84 languages spoken in Malacca. Malacca is not a big state. It's one of the smaller states in Malaysia. But there you are, you have 84 languages. Yeah. Unlike now, we tend to focus only on one or two languages. Yeah. For some people, only one language, and that's English, because they think English is international. And why it is so? Because Malacca then was cosmopolitan. Malacca was a port of call. You can see some of this drawing here. Yeah, all the big ships, all the big what do you call? I don't know what to call them, but they are here. Yeah, and they are visiting and they are trading and they are mixing around and they're bringing this culture, the junks and so on, sometimes bringing in their values, and these are the values that makes what Malacca was then. Yeah, and I think if Malacca can do it then, why can't Malacca do it now? All right, and this description of Malacca in various languages, including Latin and so on and so forth. So we begin to ask now, if language worked then, why can't language work now with all the paraphernalias, all the technologies, and the many things that we see? It is important to coexist, as we have mentioned earlier, to build trust, to build understanding, and given the various diverse dimension, different cultural values that we have today. I think this is one of my sort of wake up call. You know, why can't Malacca be that place, that center for everybody to come on and understand one another as a kind of a hub for this part of the world, if not the entire world as well? Where have we lost it? What has gone wrong when there are now a big shift between what it was and what it used to be? So the reason is I go back to this whole idea of how we actually organize our education. Yeah, taking Malaysia, for example, and I'm sure many parts of the world experience the same thing. When we are colonized by Western power, they brought in different ideas of what education is all about. And this is one article that is very, to me, eye-opening, very instructive. And it talks about Western education typically emphasizes an activist intelligence, one that emphasizes seeking and manipulating of things around the world. Manipulating means they are trying to adjust it to their point of view, to their worldview, to their understanding of what things are around them. I think this is almost given. If that's the only thing that you know, then you would want to see it from your own perspective. Yeah. And it says, interestingly, the English language itself encourages this attitude in two ways: by calling everything but people things, and by having statics, noun-based descriptive words for entities instead of a verb-based terms. For example, they call it tree instead of tree being. Yeah? The latter is more common in indigenous languages. Well, we have human being, but if you go in depth of this, as we mix along a lot more with the indigenous population, understanding our historical language dimension, we tend to subscribe to what was said. Yeah, we believe at least that everything that is created by God or the Creator has got its own form of life. They're not dead things. The trees are not dead, although they may not be breathing like us, but they do breathe in the photosynthesis. They do manufacture things. They do also grow. I think we see that. And therefore, a tree in a context is a being, right? But here it says that a language, English language, do not reckon that. And therefore, we now talk about trees as though it is something that is there and for the exploitation of human life. Yeah, so that we do not regard that as another form of life that we need now to respect, because they also have got some quote unquote consciousness perhaps, and therefore they should live like us in the context of what nature is all about. Yeah, if I understand it correctly, when I was in New Zealand, the Maoris do understand rivers as something which is living. In other words, the moment you pollute the river, it is almost like you're polluting a human being. Yeah, if you make the river dead, it's almost like killing another person, and you could be subjected to some sort of a legal rendering or a legal punishment because you have quote unquote desecrated a river. So these are basically language education, I thought, where it is rooted on the basis of the culture that provides a different kind of value. So it says that English itself makes it easier to treat other entities as object to be acted upon instead of agent with their own lives and purpose. Sometimes it also goes into human being. Yeah, and some parts of the world, I will not mention well, people are seen as subhumans. Yeah, and they are treated as not being human being, despite the full makeup of being human, just because they're differently colored, their features look different, and they are now not regarded as human being, and they are treated accordingly, almost in an animalistic way. And this is the influence of language. Without understanding the cultural context, without understanding what is a human dimension of that society, then we tend to go overboard and make things the way we see it from our own very narrow perspective. Okay? Indigenous languages often have more verbs and nouns, and opposite is true for English. And therefore, we see things as something which is alive rather than something which is there as a thing that was mentioned earlier. The indigenous worldview does not divide the world up, but sees individuals as unique. It is a right brain directed, attended to relationship, and aware of energy. I want to re-emphasize on this because as we take dominant languages and teach them to our children in schools, we are directly or indirectly are marginalizing this worldview for the indigenous languages, which is to me more progressive, richer, and also more humane. How do you bring this back as part and parcel of humanizing language education, bringing it into what is lacking in these dominant languages such as English? I think that's maybe one of the thrust areas that we need to think on. Yeah, and here it says the right hemisphere, maybe the way of thinking using the right hemisphere as compared to the left hemisphere, which is very logical, very mathematical, and very linear in its thinking. Maybe that's not the way to go. The way to go is probably use what we see today in terms of imaginary. You see the earlier slide that I talked to you about. Yeah, we use a lot more images. We use a lot more icon that probably will open up and making the relationship better in one way or another. Yeah. Just to follow up, just to finish this particular discussion here, English speakers are taught to label and categorize things. If you are a trainer, I think you probably also will do this, grouping them into units, left brain sort of orientation, left brain directed processing, divide things into category towards one another. Sometimes they is seen as a kind of a scientific thing. Yeah, science will always classify things into smaller and smaller bits. I mean, we tend to do that also. When we meet a Malaysian overseas, we say, "Where are you from?" He said, "From Malaysia." Which part of Malaysia? And he says, "Probably Johor." Which part of Johor? Huh? Which kampong is this? Huh? That kampong, and which kampong is it? And we tend to get in narrow and narrow and narrower, so that suddenly we lose that relationship because we want to use this sort of a left brain way of analyzing things, and then by analyzing things somehow or rather, it gets us a notion of the IQ. Yeah, so we tend to be very analytical, and so that we be seen to be smarter and brighter with a better IQ because we can see things in a more clear sort of ways, but somehow or other lose the connectivity when we talk about the right brain dimensions. Yeah? So the human mind is much more adaptable and malleable. We need to use that. When exposed to modern industrial society, we think about the world in a different way than our ancestors. That's provided we know what the thinking of our ancestors are. But most of the time, I think probably all of the time, we do not even know how does our ancestors think, the traditional indigenous way of taking knowledge, making knowledge work in the kind of a language that is afforded to it. Yeah? So here IQ may not actually be the way we think, instead of being a measure of natural unlearned intelligence. I like this word. Yeah, a measure of natural unlearned intelligence. In other words, there's a kind of a primordial intelligence within us. And it talks about something that relates to us being a human being. And there's a language that we use to make sure that we understand who we are using that natural unlearned intelligence. Let me try and demonstrate what it means here. When we go into different cultures, I've mentioned this earlier. In Japan, there is this whole concept of ikigai. There is a self concept that at the end of the day will tell you why you need to live for the day. Yeah, you begin to reason among yourself and all other things that we talk about: passion, mission, profession, vocation. It is taught to us very indirectly. There's no class about this, but it emerges in ourselves as part of a natural being, a part of the intelligences that we inherit as a human being. All right. Africa have got their own. It's called Ubuntu, literally means humanness, a kind of a bonding between humanity all around. Yeah. In places like Sweden, they've got a word called lagom. It's just about the balancing, moderation, not too much, not too little, just right in the context of providing the balance. Of course, yin and yang, you understand. Yeah. There's another the Danish word, yeah, huga they call it, that you talk about how to live not for perfection, but to strive and make yourself happy. And that happiness in our context has got its own meaning, and this is where the word sejahterā comes from. We are trying now to popularize it as a kind of a language form that talks about human being human, the humanness within us. And I will talk a little bit about this. Yeah? So when we talk about Sejahtera as a kind of a communication tool that bridges all the things that we talked about in terms of shared values, in terms of relationship, in terms of culturalization, in terms of making what you call understanding better. The word I think that we need to focus on is sejahtera. Now, in Malaysia, the word sejahtera is used almost everywhere. We talk about salam sejahtera, but ask the person who say what does sejahtera means, I think probably we are not able to tell more than within two sentences. Yeah? And the whole makeup of language on sejahtera, I think, is very deep. And let's try and talk about it. Yeah? Before we go into sejahtera, there's this another word that is always forgotten. I don't know whether you do this in your IPG, but the word buddhi, all right, which to me is another natural unlearned intelligence, which is provided within us in the Malay context, the Malay culture. And it has something to do with another intelligence, the intellectual dimension that we talked about. Yeah, intellect is not a Malay word; it is a word from English. Yeah, minda is not a Malay word; it's a word also from English, maybe from Latin, the word mind. Yeah, the word buddhi actually is a culmination between the intellect and the mind coming together. It's almost a hybrid concept that is, I think, now more progressive than compartmentalizing two things, intellect and mind. They never exist separately. In the context of buddhi, it exists as one. And I will try and demonstrate it. The other dimension in terms of the Malay culture, we've got the physical part, which is basically called rupa. Jasad may be something which is new, but rupa is the most rudimentary things to understand. Your look, your even sometimes your outlook in this particular sense. And the other one is rasa, emosi. Emosi is not a Malay word. The Malay word is rasa, and in fact, the Malay community are very emotionally sort of rich. Yeah, we talk about saya rasa macam ini, perasaan saya, awak menyinggung perasaan saya. We always talk about in the language of emotion because we are endowed with much of this rasa that we talked about, and certainly finally the spiritual dimension. Yeah. So when we talk about buddhi, it is almost a cumulative things of this, and that is where I think the word buddhi bahasa is a kind of a communication that expressing your own emotion, yeah. And we get into it, then you have things like the action part, sopan santun, ramah mesra, bertimbang rasa, yeah, and berhati perut. These are all the dimension of that buddhi bahasa, the subtleness, the what you call the politeness, the decorum that we use when we talk about sopan santun, that makes you finally what we call a buddhiman, yeah, a very gentleman-like uh, person who actually can sort of find its place in any society, in any culture, because he is not, quote unquote, very aggressive, very dominant, very extrovert, but he can balance himself in any culture, in any sort of civilization, if you will, right? And that is one dimension. Now, when you have Budi Bahasa, budi bahasanya lembut, lunak dan sebagainya, then it translate into behavior where we call now budi pekerti. So the expression in terms of language and the expression in terms of behavior or the body language as well also correlate with one another. So from budi pekerti, you have got lemah lembut, yeah, very polite, very non-aggressive, very accommodating in a way. We have got also berhemah, very considerate, very sincere, and also very ethical, or with a lot of decorum. This comes out of Budi Bahasa. It's difficult to find orang budi bahasanya baik tetapi budi pekertinya kasar. Yeah, people who are very polite in his own languages, they are normally not aggressive in their behavior. And this is a kind of a balance that we see. And that's part of Buddhi. And when we never teach Buddhi, and suddenly we find that, people are very aggressive nowadays, a lot of bullying, a lot of harassment. And people ask me, how come, these new generations are like this? I think the fault is ours. We never teach them about Buddhi. We never even articulate, I think, the word buddhi in the context of language or in the context of behavior. Yeah. And the last dimension, when you talk about, we know now the language, you know now the behavior. Now, what is the last consideration is about buddhi bicara. When you need to make a decision between two things, how do you make that decision? Right? And that decision comes from very important words called berakal budi. In other words, you use your mind and you use that buddhi things that we talked about, the expression, the behavior. All right. And this then is counteracted by berhati buddhi. So your akal buddhi, your fati buddhi, not the akal buddhi that is now being tested on court. That is a different akal buddhi. That's almost a kind of a vulgarization of what akal buddhi is all about. Yeah. There is this, so another, the consideration of the mind and the consideration of the heart needs to be balanced together before you arrive at the decision. And this is almost primordial in us. This part of the human being. And that's where language comes in. And we have got the word jiwa raga. That's, in other words, again, the whole composition of the body in terms of physical and the spiritual dimension. Yeah. So all this leads to this personality called Buddhiman that engulfs everything, that makes the human being the complete human being that we know, given the language, not only in terms of its verbalization, but also in terms of its action and also in terms of its consideration in decision making. So finally, we talk about all these things in one go. You cannot separate them. Yeah, you need to have Budi Bahasa, Budi Bicara, and Budi Pekerti in one go. That is a complete human being you are. Yeah, you cannot say today I'm just going to do Budi Bahasa, I will do Budi Pekerti tomorrow, and the next day I'll do Budi Bicara. No. Yeah. So in other words, we human being in this particular context has got our own leadership role in trying to balance our own world. This is what I call the microcosm. We are balancing it all the time using this kind of understanding that is part of language. Needs to be educated, but it never happens, at least in our scenario. I'm not sure in other parts of the world. But I know in Bhutan they are doing this. When they talk about gross national happiness, they're teaching these people how to be happy and using their own concept and their own understanding. In Malaysia, this will not happen. Maybe the IPG will take this on as another dimension of what language education is all about. Until and unless we know how to balance this, yeah, that I think my language education to me is not complete. Language education is borrowed by somebody else's, that there's very little sort of indigenous contribution to it that makes person a better person within his own context. Yeah. Now this micro balance now needs to go into the bigger picture of the macro balance, and this is a macro balance. The macro balance with life itself is balanced. When your internal life is balanced, then the life outside is balanced. And that's where the word sejahtera comes in. To observe this balance between the inner world and the outer world, to observe the balance between you and your externalities, and then you and your fellow beings, you and the creator, and you being whatever else that is presented outside. And we need to communicate this, as I mentioned to you. How what is the lesson that we learn when we see a leaf falling down? To some people, it's a mark of autumn, perhaps. Yeah, when all the trees are losing their tree, it could be winter. It's very obvious. But in a tropical country, you don't see this. But there are other signals that we are already not mindful of because we have lost this concept of a balance. The Sajatra idea is no longer there. Okay, let me try and conclude this by just explaining to you what Sajatra is all about. Sajatra recognizes that we are a human being, but from a spiritual point of view. As I've mentioned, at least from the Malay point of view, we are not only spiritual, we are also emotional beings. Look at the Malay drama, sometimes look at the Malay parliament, Malaysian parliament, yeah. They're all very emotional sometimes. And that's also not good because they are not able to control their emotion. And all of these are built on that ethical ground, which is Buddhi part of it. And we need to develop this first to be that human. You're talking about humanizing, to be that human to start off with. Yeah, and these aspects here are basically, these are already considered in our falsafah pendidikan kebangsaan, the national education philosophy that talks about spirituality, emotion, physical, and also intellectual dimension. This is where we start off, right? And once we start off, then we create this microcosm of one part, and the other part then will go the intellectual part. In other words, the connectivity between the brain and the heart will create this ambient where Buddhi could strive on. And then we go into the thinking part, which is the Buddhi Bichara, and part of the psychological part. This creates a microcosm for us to understand who we are. In other words, if we want to humanize something, then we need to come into this realm. Once it is well balanced, as the context of micro balance that we talk about, then we are ready for the macrocosm, looking at the ecological dimension, looking at the economic dimension, at the culture, and also society. This is almost a kind of a framework. If you imagine this is a football field, this is the field that we are going to play. And we are already endowed with all the physical capabilities to take on the world, as it were. All right. And that's a macrocosm that we talked about. The macrocosm is something that we need to balance our way of life and our understanding so that we can remain to be human, not a second class robot, not a machine, or not a slave of somebody else. We have our own right and dignity to live the way we are created. And this is what I think is important. And there's a language that makes us more what they call adaptive in that environment by telling people who we are and what we represent. Yeah. So these things will be the macrocosm, and these two must be in a balance, the macrocosm and the microcosm, so that we are able to sustain the world, as it were. Right. So if you look at this the pieces here, actually it spells the spices. Yeah? Spirituality, the physio psychological, the I will be the intellectual, C will be the cultural and also the cognitive, E will be the economics, ecological, and also ethical, and the other S is societal. And these are the elements that needs to be balanced to get a kind of feeling of sajatra. And once it is within you, then you're able to do this. And our life, therefore, is about making this balancing act using buddhi as a fulcrum, as it were. Every day we go to work, we need to find a balance for this, so that we remain in the Sajatra concept, we remain in the Sajatra and beyond. There's, like I say, there is no way to translate this. Well-being is probably the closest, but it is not there because there are 9 other elements that we need to think about. Yeah, and this balance actually now has been proven scientifically, works on our own being in the context of the chemical transmission within this. Yeah, they give 3 examples of dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. And this level of a chemical in our nervous system actually regulates itself depending on where we are in terms of the state of balance. If you are fully balanced, then you've got every complement, right? And you feel, happiness, you feel loved. Yeah. When they're defective in one or the other, then you get the reverse. You get anxiety, you get depression, you get state. In other words, we are able. It is the thing. We are able to control our own emotion, our own happiness, our own well-being, using different languages, perhaps, to demonstrate this. And there is now an exercise that if you use certain languages, you find that your heart beats better as compared to using a different kind of words. An expression that we use in a different way will elicit a different kind of emotion as compared to different kind of language that you use to give a converse of that emotion. Yeah. So that is what I thought the natural unlearned intelligence that perhaps language needs to look at it. Buddhi being one, Sejahtera is another one. I'm sure different countries have different context. And this is, I think, where the missing part is when we are confronted with challenges like COVID environment, that we need to go back to our own humanness, our own humanity, to actually build up that resiliency that we have lost or we are not told how to cope being a human person that actually can live anywhere and everywhere until and unless you know how to actually create this balance within you. So I will stop there, and I would just want to create quote Rumi when Rumi talks about when we talk about the balance, meaning to say you want to find a clear path in the center. So there's no extremism in this exercise. There's no room for extremism. You want to find that balance, and this is what I was emphasizing on the micro and the macro balance, not only within yourself but within outside. And that's where I think we will find the wisdom of living in a very challenging world. Without wisdom, I think we are all dead, because at the end of the day, to survive is to not just based on knowledge, but also the derivative of that knowledge to give you wisdom. And that's why the people of yesteryears are more happy than we are, because they've got wisdom. In our case, we have got so much of knowledge, we are drowned in knowledge, but where is the wisdom? Yeah, some of you, I'm sure, have been teachers for a long time. What wisdom do you get from your experience in teaching? I think there's very few, because we are not moving in the path that directs us to wisdom. We are just so bogged down in the language, in the knowledge, and create more knowledge and more languages that finally find us in a kind of a muddle when we are faced with a pandemic of this nature. So it's already 1 hour now. Let me stop. I hope I have given you some very provocative way of looking at what language education is all about, which culminates into wisdom. right? And how we can probably look at the future and try to make different adjustment so that our human being or being human still remains with us rather than being a second class robot. This is now being forced onto us in so many ways using the technology, sometimes for the wrong purpose. So thank you, Dr. Munira. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you so much, Tan Sri. I think you have shared a lot of your wisdom with us today. There's a lot of information, very interesting concepts of being human, about humanity, education, and humanity, and also about going back to our roots and exploring nature to find the balance between the world that is full of technology nowadays. A lot of things are very much mechanical. There's a lot of pressure to be good in so many things, especially with gadgets. Using them in our classrooms, in teaching, in getting information, and even in communication, which is actually all very great. I think these are great inventions, but of course, the downfall of it, the downside of this digitalization would be the divide in our community, dividing. It's really an irony to me. Some of the slogans that we see with telecommunication advertisements saying that communication using technology is supposed to bring people closer, but actually in reality they are dividing us. There are invisible barriers, okay, between the different levels or layers of society, which is again it's really an irony, or surreal for that matter. And then we lose meaning in our communication, in our interaction, where the meaning of language, a meaning of a word is being interpreted in so many ways. And again, it's an irony. Communication is supposed to be clear, but there is miscommunication in our conversations. So yeah, it's very interesting, really. I really enjoyed, and I'm sure the viewers enjoyed the session today. We do have one question, and I kind of paraphrase the question. Okay, so talking about Budi, so how do we ensure Budi is sustained or maybe practiced and applied in our education? Okay, so that's the question for
I
you.
think that's a very good question and a timely question. I think let me reflect back when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I think Buddhi is already told to us from perhaps day one. I mean, if you talk about digital natives now, that time we were Buddhi natives.
Mm,
You know,
yeah,
it
yeah.
says you are not who you are kalau kita tidak pandai berbudi. And the budi is a concept that is so difficult to explain. We can only explain it in pantun. Pisang emas di
Mm,
bawah belayar, masak
yeah.
sebiji di atas peti. Hutang emas boleh dibayar, hutang budi dibawa mati. I mean,
Yeah.
to convert the last two sentence, translate the last two sentence in, you can
Mm,
pay a debt in gold, but for
mm,
budi, you have to take it to your grave.
yeah.
There's no way of repaying it. In other
Mm,
words, the work of Buddhi, the understanding of Buddhi is beyond
mm,
us. It's a kind of a compassion that we get involved with. I mean, that's the humanness of
mm,
us. Kita
mm,
diajar berbudi. Kita belajar
yeah.
orang berbudi, kita berbahasa. You know, that's
Mm,
another thing. Now,
mm,
if Munira give
mm,
me something, I need to reciprocate, even though small
mm,
as it is. But I need to
yeah.
reciprocate. You know, it's not
Mm,
that I'm just taking. The world today is just about taking
mm,
things.
yeah.
We are not giving anything to anybody.
Mm-hmm,
Yeah, and
yeah.
as the richer you are, the more you take.
Yeah.
This is the irony. So the Buddhi is
Mm-hmm.
part of us. I think that would
Mm-hmm.
be the first what they call value that we need to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to make
Yeah.
us human as a very polite human being. And I think this a concept of the East. We believe in water logic rather than a rock
Yeah.
logic, as it were. We
Mm-hmm.
don't push our way around, unlike some cultures that they want to be dominant, they want to impose values on you. We don't, and that's why sometimes living in the West, to me, is difficult
Mm-hmm.
because I keep
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
encountering these walls and that
Mm-hmm.
forces you to do this and that, and this whole notion of us being that buddhiman, I think needs to be
Mm-hmm.
brought back. And the word buddhiman pun dah does not exist anymore. You know,
Mm-hmm.
so how do you bring this as part and parcel of our understanding of being human? And
Mm-hmm.
what is the language that we need to put in so that the Buddhi, which is part of our primordial intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
grew up with the language? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it is not just Bahasa Melayu. If I want to speak English with Buddhi, I will use the English way in the best way I could. Although sometimes that language could be very, very kind of, very kind of aggressive. But us being
Mm-hmm.
Malay with a Buddhi, we try to use the language in such a way that we do not offend people. The last thing untuk mengaibkan or to create shame on people with the language you use, to create dissension, to create hatred, is not about Buddhi. But look at your social media now.
Mm-hmm.
Social media is just about irritating other people. The more people you irritate, the more likes you get, the more successful
Mm-hmm.
you are. But it is
Yeah.
very contradictory to what Buddhi is all about. So if you understand Buddhi, you probably doesn't want even to subscribe to social media. And indeed, is what's happening now. When you look at the latest, the latest statement when we talk about Facebook.
Yeah.
Facebook, they say, is not interested in creating human
Mm-hmm.
dignity, is more interested in
Yeah.
profiteering. We are right there.
Yeah.
We're using it as though it's part and parcel of our nature. It is not our nature, and therefore we need to
Mm-hmm.
find what is suitable for us. But to start off with,
Yeah.
we must understand that we are human beings.
Yeah.
If you
Mm-hmm.
don't understand that, then this digital native thing, I think to me,
Yeah.
is not helpful because we
Mm-hmm.
think you're very technological. And
Yeah.
therefore, the moment the baby cry, you just give them a
Yeah.
handful, and hopefully that he or she will be quiet and lose his
Mm-hmm.
humanity at the same time. It is a whole revolution. I think we cannot
Mm-hmm.
just do this on a piecemeal because
Mm-hmm.
we've lose the whole context of what being
Mm-hmm.
human is all about vis-a-vis education.
Okay. So thank you so much once again,
My
Tan
pleasure.
Sri, for sharing your experiences and your wonderful thoughts today. I think after this, I will go back and really think about what you said about nature and Buddhi and being human again, rather than just being so dependent on devices and technology. So yeah, something for me to really rethink hard about my lifestyles, and I'm sure the viewers will do that as well.
And,
Okay, so
and hopefully a student will benefit
yes,
from you. I think at the end of the day, I think the
yes,
student is more important because they are the growing
mm-hmm.
generation that are not given all this. I mean,
Yeah,
they are the lost generation, quote unquote, for my point of view,
mm-hmm.
because they are not given all these
Mm-hmm.
tools. At least I have
Yeah,
the advantage of learning what Buddhi is all about. Now they don't
mm-hmm.
even know those words, so we need to give them that so that they can
Yes,
be also equally facilitated in deciding what they want to do in the future. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the
yes.
discussion. Hopefully, we will
Thank
connect
you.
again in one way or the
Yes,
other.
of
Assalamualaikum.
course, inshallah. Waalaikumsalam. So that remark concludes the webinar session for today. Thank you all for watching. We hope you have learned and enjoyed this presentation. I'd like to thank our speaker, studio director Encik Syarul Azhar Ali, the producer Dr. Suras Kanagasabai, the Educational Technology Division, the producer of EduWeb TV, Ministry of Education Malaysia, and also our rapporteurs, and not to forget our wonderful viewers. Okay, and please do not forget our next webinar series will be held tomorrow, Wednesday, October 27th. And this is going to be our final webinar for this year. It will be live at 11 a.m. Malaysian time, and we will have Miss Anis Alisha Abdullah, the Director of Institute of Teacher Education, Tun Abdul Razak campus. And also, right after that, after our final webinar, we will have our closing ceremony. So join us for that as well. Okay, until then, jumpa lagi. See you again. Goodbye from Malaysia.